The gun bucked hard in his hands, spitting 50 rounds in less than 6 seconds, and the concrete bunker ahead didn't go silent. It disintegrated. Sergeant Eddie Harmon didn't let off the trigger. The barrel of his Thompson stayed cool, steady, roaring like a beast that refused to tire. Across the smoking trench, a German voice screamed one word over and over: Grabenbrecher. Grabenbrecher. Trench breaker. It was February 1945, and the war in Western Europe had reached its most vicious, grinding phase. The Third Reich was collapsing, but collapse didn't mean surrender. It meant desperation. Every town, every bridge, every bunker was defended like it was the last piece of ground on earth. German forces dug in along the Siegfried Line and the Ruhr Pocket with fanaticism born not of hope, but of fear. They knew what was coming. The Allies were closing in from every side, and the only choice left was to fight until there was nothing left to fight with. For American infantry pushing into the German heartland, this was not the war of sweeping tank columns and dramatic breakthroughs. This was a war of alleyways and cellars, blown-out factories and fortified farmhouses. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. A silent street could erupt into gunfire from 3 directions. A shattered building could hold a machine gun nest that had been waiting for hours. Every block was a kill zone. Every advance came at the cost of blood. And in that kind of war, firepower was everything. The Thompson submachine gun had been with the U.S. Army since before Pearl Harbor. It was beloved and cursed in equal measure. The troops who carried it loved the punch it delivered. Big .45 ACP rounds that hit like hammers and dropped men in their tracks. They loved the reliability, the heft, the fact that it never jammed even when caked in mud or drenched in rain. But they hated how fast it burned through ammunition. They hated how the barrel heated up after just a few bursts, forcing to stop and let it cool or risk warping the rifling. And most of all, they hated that in a close-quarters firefight, the moment you had to pause was the moment you died. The Thompson was a raid weapon, an ambush tool, a gun built for short, violent bursts. It was never meant to lay down sustained fire. That was the job of the Browning automatic rifle, or the belt-fed machine guns mounted on tripods. But those weapons were heavy, slow to reposition, and needed crews to operate. The Thompson was personal. It was carried by sergeants, by scouts, by men who led from the front. And those men needed something more. So in the winter of 1944, a strange experiment began. It started in a repair depot somewhere behind the lines in Belgium, in a cold, oil-stained tent where armorers worked 12-hour shifts, keeping weapons functional. One of them, a technical sergeant named Carl Dietrich, had been a machinist before the war. He'd worked in a tool and die shop in Pennsylvania, making parts for factory equipment. He understood metal. He understood heat. And he understood that the standard Thompson barrel wasn't built for what the war had become. Dietrich had seen the reports coming back from rifle companies. Jammed triggers. Scorched hands. Barrels so overheated they glowed dull red in the dark. The standard barrel on the M1A1 Thompson was relatively thin. It had to be to keep the weapon light and maneuverable. But thin barrels couldn't handle sustained fire. The heat had nowhere to go. It built up fast, expanded the metal, and eventually caused failures. So Dietrich did something unauthorized. He pulled a Thompson off the repair rack, stripped it down, and began fabricating a new barrel. Heavier, thicker, with more mass to absorb and distribute heat. He machined it by hand over the course of 3 days, working in stolen hours between official jobs. He test-fired it in a snowy field behind the depot, ripping through 5 full magazines without stopping. The barrel stayed cool. The gun stayed true. The shot stayed tight. Word spread fast. Within 2 weeks, rifle platoons across the front were requesting the modification. Armorers and other units started copying Dietrich's design. Some went further, adding finned heat sinks or reinforced receivers. The modifications were never officially sanctioned. There was no technical manual, no supply chain, no serial numbers or nomenclature updates. It was field ingenuity, pure and simple. Soldiers making the war match the weapon, instead of the other way around. And the modified Thompsons changed everything. Sergeant Eddie Harmon got his heavy-barrel Thompson in early February, just as his company was preparing to assault a fortified rail junction near the town of Durham. Harmon was 26 years old, from a coal town in West Virginia, and he'd been in combat since Normandy. He'd survived the Bocage, the Hurtgen Forest, and the frozen hell of the Bulge. He'd seen men die in every possible way. He'd learned that survival wasn't about courage. It was about volume of fire and speed of movement. The man who shot first and shot most was the man who walked away. When the armorer handed him the modified Thompson, Harmon's first thought was that it was too heavy. The new barrel added nearly 2 pounds to the front end. It changed the balance. It felt less like a submachine gun and more like a light machine gun. But when he test-fired it, he understood. He emptied an entire magazine in one long, sustained burst, and the barrel barely warmed. He reloaded and did it again. And again, the weapon didn't flinch. It didn't warp. It just kept firing. Harmon looked at the armorer and said, "This thing's a monster." The armorer grinned. "Germans have been calling it something else. Heard it from a prisoner last week. They call it the Grabenbrecher. Trench breaker." Harmon liked that. The assault on the rail junction began before dawn. The objective was a cluster of stone buildings and reinforced warehouses on the east side of the Ruhr River, connected by a rail line that the Germans were still using to move supplies south. Intelligence said the position was lightly held. Maybe a platoon, maybe less. Intelligence was wrong. As Harmon's platoon moved through the ruins of a bombed-out neighborhood, the air was sharp and cold, the sky a low, oppressive gray. Smoke from artillery fires drifted through the streets. The snow had turned to slush, soaking through boots and pant legs. Every man was exhausted. Every man was on edge. They'd learned not to trust the quiet. They reached the rail junction just as the sun broke the horizon, casting long shadows through the shattered buildings. Harmon's squad moved in a staggered line, rifles up, heads low. The first building looked clear. The second looked clear. Then the third building, a 2-story brick warehouse with blown-out windows, erupted in gunfire. An MG-42 opened up from the second floor, its distinctive buzzsaw roar tearing through the dawn. Rounds ripped across the street, kicking up chunks of stone and frozen mud. 2 men went down immediately. The rest scattered, diving behind rubble, into doorways, anywhere that offered cover. Harmon hit the ground behind a low wall and heard the impacts slamming into the bricks inches above his head. The MG-42 was a nightmare weapon of the European theater. It fired at over 1,200 rounds per minute, twice the rate of the American .30 cal. It could chew through an entire squad in seconds. The only way to deal with it was to suppress it long enough for someone to flank, or to call in artillery and level the whole building. But artillery took time, and time meant more men bleeding out in the street. Harmon lifted his Thompson and squeezed the trigger. The heavy barrel roared. The recoil was manageable, smooth, absorbed by the extra weight up front. He swept the muzzle across the second-floor windows, walking the fire left to right, punching rounds into brick and wood and glass. He didn't stop. He didn't pause. He burned through the first magazine and reloaded without taking his eyes off the building. The moment the fresh mag was in, he opened up again. The MG-42 stopped. It was only for a few seconds, but it was enough. 2 riflemen sprinted forward and hurled grenades to the ground floor windows. The explosions were dull, muffled thumps. Smoke poured out. Harmon stood and moved, firing as he advanced, his Thompson laying down a continuous stream of suppressive fire. Another soldier ran past him with a bar, adding to the storm of lead pouring into the building. They reached the entrance. Harmon kicked the door in and swept inside, the Thompson leading. The interior was dark, choked with dust and smoke. He moved fast, clearing corners, checking shadows. A German soldier stumbled out of the side room, coughing, hands raised. Harmon didn't shoot. He shoved him toward the door and kept moving. Upstairs, the MG-42 crew was dead, slumped over their weapon. The grenades had done their work. Harmon checked the rest of the floor, found it empty, and moved back down. Outside, his platoon had pushed forward, securing the next 2 buildings. The rail yard beyond was still contested, but the first line of defense had broken. Harmon reloaded his Thompson, checked the barrel. It was warm but not hot and kept moving. The fight for the rail junction lasted 6 more hours. It wasn't a battle. It was a series of brutal, close-range engagements, each one a desperate scramble for cover and fire superiority. The Germans fought from cellars, from behind rail cars, from foxholes dug into the railroad itself. They used Panzerfaust, machine guns, grenades, even bayonets. They didn't retreat. They made the Americans pay for every meter. And through it all, Harmon's Thompson never stopped. He fired from doorways, from windows, from behind overturned wagons. He burned through magazine after magazine, laying down suppressive fire while his squad maneuvered. The heavy barrel absorbed the heat, stayed straight, kept the rounds on target. Other men with standard Thompsons had to pause, had to wait, had to switch to sidearms when their barrels got too hot. Harmon never did. He just kept shooting. By mid-afternoon, the rail junction was in American hands. The cost was 11 dead, 23 wounded. The Germans left behind over 40 bodies and a dozen prisoners. Harmon sat on a pile of rubble, his hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, and stared at the Thompson resting across his knees. The barrel was scorched black, but it was intact, functional. Ready? One of the riflemen walked over and sat down next to him. How many mags you go through? Harmon had to think. 22, maybe 23. Jesus Christ. Harmon nodded. This thing doesn't quit. Word of the modified Thompson spread faster than any official report. Soldiers talked. Officers listened. By March 1945, dozens of heavy-barreled Thompsons were in circulation across the Western Front, all of them hand-modified, all of them unofficial. Some units even started requesting specific armors by name, asking for the Dietrich mod or the Belgian heavy. The modifications varied slightly from unit to unit, but the principle was always the same: more mass, more cooling, more sustained fire. The Germans noticed. In captured documents and interrogation reports from late March and early April, German soldiers repeatedly mentioned a new American weapon. They described it as a machine gun that sounded like a submachine gun, a weapon that didn't stop, that chewed through defensive positions without pause. Some called it the Sternbrecher, Stormbreaker. Others used Grabenbrecher, Trenchbreaker. The name stuck. But the most telling detail came from a German Hauptmann captured near Remagen. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had fought at Stalingrad and Kursk, who had seen the worst the Red Army could throw at the Wehrmacht. When asked about American tactics, he said something that stayed with the interrogators. The Russians came at us with waves of men. We could kill them, but they kept coming. It was a matter of will and ammunition. But the Americans, they come with fire, continuous fire. You cannot lift your head. You cannot return fire. You can only wait until they are on top of you. And by then it is too late. He paused and added, the gun that does not stop, that is the one we fear most. The heavy-barreled Thompson wasn't a miracle weapon. It didn't end the war. It didn't change the strategic picture. But in the grinding, brutal, close-quarters combat that defined the final months in Europe, it gave American infantry a critical edge. It allowed small units to suppress and maneuver without waiting for support. It turned squad leaders into one-man fire bases. It made every assault faster, more aggressive, more lethal. And it did all of this without ever appearing in a technical manual, without ever being officially adopted, without ever receiving a formal designation. It was a soldier's weapon, born in necessity and ingenuity, forged in the same fire it was designed to survive. Sergeant Eddie Harmon carried his heavy-barreled Thompson all the way to the Elbe River. He used it to clear bunkers along the Ruhr, to suppress snipers in the rubble of Essen, to hold a roadblock outside Leipzig when a German counterattack tried to break through at dawn. The barrel never failed. The weapon never quit. After the German surrender, Harmon was ordered to turn in his weapon for depot storage. He refused. He told his company commander that the Thompson was his, that he'd earned it, that it had saved his life more times than he could count. The CO didn't push. A week later, Harmon rotated home. He kept the Thompson in a locked case in his basement for the rest of his life. He never fired it again. He never had to. But sometimes, late at night, he would take it out, run his hand along the heavy barrel, and remember the sound it made, the sound of a weapon that never stopped. The sound of survival. The modified Thompsons disappeared after the war. Most were scrapped or lost in post-war inventory chaos. A few ended up in museums, mislabeled as standard M1A1S. The armorers who built them went home and went back to being machinists, mechanics, toolmakers. Carl Dietrich opened a machine shop in Pennsylvania and never told anyone what he'd done during the war. He died in 1983, and his obituary made no mention of the weapon that carried his name across the front lines. But the idea lived on. The principle of the heavy-barrel Thompson, sustained fire, thermal management, field modification, became part of the institutional knowledge of the U.S. military. It influenced the design of later submachine guns, squad automatic weapons, and even modern carbines. The lessons learned in those cold, desperate fights in Germany became doctrine, encoded in manuals and training, passed down through generations of soldiers who never knew where it came from, and in the German military archives, buried in reports and letters and interrogation transcripts, the word remained. Grabenbrecher, trench breaker, a weapon that did not stop, a weapon that broke the will of men who thought they could not be broken. War is often decided by grand strategies, by air superiority and armor divisions and logistical chains that stretch across continents. But in the end, wars are won by men in muddy boots, standing in smoking ruins, holding weapons at work when everything else has failed. The heavy-barreled Thompson was one of those weapons. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't elegant. But it was exactly what was needed, exactly when it was needed, and that, more than any medal or commendation, is the highest praise a weapon can receive. The lesson isn't about firepower. It's about adaptation. It's about soldiers and armorers who saw a problem and fixed it, not because they were ordered to, but because lives depended on it. It's about the space between official doctrine and battlefield reality, and the men who live in that space and make it work. The heavy-barreled Thompson didn't exist in the manuals. It didn't exist in the supply chain. But it existed where it mattered, in the hands of men who needed it, in the moments when nothing else would do. And when the enemy gave it a name, when they feared it enough to mark in their reports, that was the moment it became legend. The trench breaker, the gun that never stopped. The story of the heavy-barreled Thompson didn't end with Eddie Harmon or Carl Dietrich. It rippled outward, touching dozens of units, hundreds of soldiers, and changing the way American infantry fought in the final, desperate months of the war. To understand the full impact, you have to understand what combat looked like in the spring of 1945, when the Third Reich was dying but still fighting with the fury of a cornered animal. By March, the Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. The great natural barrier that had protected Germany for centuries was breached in multiple places, and American, British, and Canadian forces were pouring into the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. This was an open country. It wasn't tank terrain. It was a landscape of factories and coal mines, rail yards and worker housing, all of it fortified, all of it defended. The Wehrmacht had been pushed back for months, but they hadn't disintegrated. They were bloodied, exhausted, low on fuel and ammunition, but they were still capable of killing, and they were fighting on their own soil now. That changed everything. In France and Belgium, German soldiers could rationalize retreat. They were defending occupied territory, not the fatherland. But in Germany, every town had names they recognized. Every street held memories. Surrender meant the enemy would march past their homes, their schools, their churches. Propaganda had told them for years that the Allies would bring annihilation, that Bolshevism and capitalism would destroy everything German. Some believed it. Others just fought because there was no other choice. Desertion meant execution. Capture meant an uncertain fate. So they stayed in their bunkers and kept firing. For the American infantry, this made every engagement unpredictable. A village might surrender without a shot, or it might hide 50 Volkssturm, old men and teenage boys with Panzerfaust and machine guns, who would fight until every building was rubble. You never knew until you were already committed. That's where the heavy-barreled Thompsons proved their worth. In the village of Huxwagen, northeast of Cologne, a platoon from the 8th Infantry Division was tasked with clearing a cluster of stone houses overlooking a narrow valley. Intelligence said the town was empty. Reconnaissance photos showed no movement. But when the lead squad moved into the main street, They were hit from three sides. Machine gun fire poured from upper windows. A Panzerfaust streaked out and missed an advancing Sherman by inches, slamming into a garden wall and spraying shrapnel across the street. Two riflemen went down in the first 10 seconds. The platoon sergeant, a man named Roy Callahan, had a heavy barrel Thompson. He'd gotten it 2 weeks earlier from an armorer in Dusseldorf, after his standard Thompson had warped his barrel during a firefight in a rail tunnel. Callahan was 31, a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, and he knew how to read a fight. This wasn't delaying action. This wasn't a patrol that stumbled into contact. This was an ambush planned and executed by people who knew the terrain. Callahan sprinted to the nearest doorway and kicked it open. Inside was a narrow hallway with stairs leading up. He didn't wait. He charged up the stairs, his Thompson roaring, firing blind into the second floor. Plaster exploded off the walls. With splintered, a door at the top flew open, and a German soldier appeared, rifle raised. Callahan cut him down before he could fire. He kept moving, sweeping through rooms, clearing them with bursts of fire that chewed through furniture and shattered windows. Behind him, his squad followed, using a suppression to move up and spread out. The noise was deafening. The Thompson's heavy barrel allowed Callahan to fire continuously without overheating, turning him into a mobile base of fire. He leaned out a shattered window and hosed down the building across the street, forcing the machine gun crew to duck. One of his riflemen used the opening to sprint forward and toss a grenade through a ground floor window. The explosion silenced the German gun. The fight lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, the platoon had secured the village, killed or captured 15 enemy combatants, and lost 3 men. Callahan's Thompson had fired over 300 rounds without a single malfunction. The barrel was hot, but not dangerously so. It cooled down in minutes and was ready to go again. Callahan didn't write a report about it. He didn't file a commendation for the armorer who'd modified his weapon. He just kept moving, kept fighting, kept using the Thompson to do what needed to be done. That was the nature of the weapon spread. It was organic, word of mouth, driven by results rather than bureaucracy. But the results kept adding up. In the city of Essen, a company from the 79th Infantry Division was tasked with clearing a massive steel mill that the Germans had turned into a fortress. The mill was a labyrinth of catwalks, furnaces, and machine rooms, all of it dark, all of it perfect for ambush. Standard tactics call for overwhelming firepower. Bring in tanks, level the place with artillery, then send infantry to mop up. But the mill was surrounded by residential neighborhoods, and division command didn't want civilian casualties. So the infantry had to go in light, for sergeants in that company had heavy barrel Thompsons. They led the assault, moving through the mill in small teams, using the weapon-sustained fire to suppress enemy positions while riflemen flanked. The confined spaces amplified the sound of the Thompsons, turning each burst into a thunderclap that echoed to the metal corridors. The Germans, many of them folksturm with minimal training, broke and ran. The mill was secured in under 2 hours, with minimal American casualties. The division commander, a colonel who had spent most of the war pushing paper in rear echelon positions, visited the mill after fighting and asked to see one of the modified Thompsons. He held it, felt the weight, ran his hand along the barrel. Then he asked why he'd never heard of this modification through official channels. The answer was simple: because it worked. Official channels were slow. Official channels required testing, evaluation, committee review, budget approval. Official channels took months, sometimes years. But the war didn't wait. The war demanded solutions now, not next quarter. So soldiers made their own solutions, and the best ones spread to the ranks like wildfire. The colonel tried to get the modification officially recognized. He wrote reports, sent samples back to ordnance depots, even contacted the Springfield Armory. But by the time his request made it to the chain of command, the war in Europe was over. The modified Thompsons were already being turned in, stripped for parts, or buried in inventory. The moment had passed, but the impact hadn't. One of the most detailed accounts of the heavy barrel Thompson's effectiveness comes from a German officer named Lieutenant Friedrich Kurz, who was captured near Kassel in early April 1945. Kurz was interrogated by American intelligence officers, and his testimony was filed away in an archive that wouldn't be declassified for decades. Kurz described an engagement where his platoon, dug in along a roadblock outside a small industrial town, was overrun by an American squad in less than 5 minutes. He said the Americans used a weapon he'd never encountered before, something that sounded like a submachine gun but fired with the continuity of a light machine gun. He said his men couldn't return fire because the volume of incoming rounds was too intense. Every time someone tried to lift their head, bullets would slam into the position. It was not suppression, Kurz said. It was elimination. We could not fight back. We could only surrender or die. When asked if he thought the weapon was a new model, Kurz shook his head. It was the American submachine gun. I had seen it before, but this was different. It did not pause. It did not stop. That was what made it impossible to defend against. The interrogators pressed him on this. How could he be sure it was the same weapon? Kurz pointed to the sound. The Thompson had a distinctive report, a sharp, heavy crack that was different from the higher-pitched chatter of German MP-40s or Soviet PPSH-41s. He knew the sound. He'd heard it in Italy, in France. But this version didn't have the pauses, the gaps where the shooter had to let the barrel cool or switch magazines. It was continuous. We called it the Grabenbrecher, Kurz said, because it broke through defenses like a trench wall collapsing. You could not hold against it. That testimony, buried in archives for decades, is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that the modified Thompsons had a psychological impact, as well as a tactical one. Fear is a weapon. When an enemy believes they cannot fight back, they stop trying. The heavy-barrel Thompson created that belief, but the weapon had limits. The added weight made it harder to carry over long distances. Soldiers who humped their gear through miles of rubble and mud felt every extra ounce. The heavy barrel also made the weapon slightly less maneuverable in extremely tight spaces, like narrow trenches or crawl spaces. And while the barrel could handle sustained fire, the rest of the weapon still had failure points. Magazines could jam. Firing pins could break. Springs could wear out. The modified Thompsons weren't invincible. They were just better. And in a war where better could mean the difference between living and dying, that was enough. Sergeant Eddie Harmon survived the war, but not everyone who carried a heavy-barrel Thompson did. Private First Class Leonard Hayes, from a rifle company in the 99th Infantry Division, was killed in a firefight outside Würzburg on April 6, 1945. He was 20 years old. His platoon sergeant later wrote that Hayes had been using a modified Thompson to suppress an enemy position when a sniper shot him through the neck. The Thompson was found next to his body, still loaded, barrel cool. It had fired over 200 rounds that day without a malfunction. Hayes' death wasn't unique. Thousands of men died in the final weeks of the war, cut down in fights that didn't change the strategic outcome, in towns whose names were forgotten within months. The heavy-barrel Thompson couldn't save them all. No weapon could, but it gave them a chance. It gave them an edge. And in war, edges are everything. The heavy-barrel Thompson was never mass-produced. After the war, the remaining modified weapons were either destroyed, lost, or quietly absorbed into private collections. The U.S. military moved on to new weapons, new doctrines. The Thompson itself was phased out in favor of lighter, cheaper submachine guns like the M3 grease gun. The lessons learned from the modification were filed away in after-action reports that few people read, but the idea survived. In Korea, American armorers began experimenting with heavier barrels on M1 carbines, tried to improve their sustained fire capability. In Vietnam, the same principle was applied to early versions of the M16, leading to the development of the M16A1 with its heavier barrel profile. In Iraq and Afghanistan, special operations units used modified weapons with enhanced cooling systems and reinforced barrels, allowing for sustained automatic fire in close-quarters battles. Every one of those innovations traced back, in some small way, to the field modifications made by men like Carl Dietrich in the winter of 1944. Men who saw a problem and fixed it. Men who understood that doctrine was a starting point, not a straitjacket. Men who knew that the best weapon was the one that worked when you needed it most. The heavy-barrel Thompson was a product of necessity, But necessity is the mother of all battlefield innovation. When soldiers are dying, they don't wait for permission to adapt. They adapt or they die. The men who carried the Grabenbrecher adapted. And because they did, they lived. That's a lesson. Not that heavier barrels are better. Not that modification should replace official development. The lesson is that war is chaos, and chaos rewards those who can think, improvise, and act without waiting for someone else to solve their problems. Eddie Harmon understood that. Carl Dietrich understood that. Every man who carried a heavy-barrel Thompson into combat understood that. And when the Germans gave a name, when they feared enough to mark it in their reports, to warn their soldiers about it, to recognize it as something new and dangerous, they confirmed what those men already knew. They were carrying something special, something that didn't quit, something that broke through, the trench breaker. If this story hit you, don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from?